Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Hi. I want to thank everybody so much for joining. I know that we've got folks watching on Facebook. I do want to remind folks, if you want to join us for our exclusive Q&A afterwards, we are posting the Zoom meeting information in the comments. So please register so that way you can come and engage with us after the panel. But yeah, I want to thank you all for joining Team Loudlight tonight to talk about what the F happened in the 2020 election. What does it mean for Kansans as far as voter suppression or other voting legislation may come? But we'll get into that. In case you don't know all of our team members, I'll just give brief rounds of introductions. So first of all, I want to welcome Davis Hammett, our president and the founder of Loudlight. In 2015, he founded Loudlight to address the disparity in civic engagement with the goal of developing a critical mass in youth voter turnout that transforms Kansas. When Davis isn't running around the State House covering legislative session and Loudlight's weekly recap videos, he's focusing on working to research and address the remaining obstacles that block citizens from voting or leave their ballots uncounted. I want to introduce Anita Austin. She's been the program director at Loudlight for the past 3 years. She manages and directs youth fellowship programs. Those fellowships cover everything from deep policy research to monitoring the legislative session to engaging electoral programs such as our voter registration and get out the vote efforts. Anita coordinates with colleges and universities in Kansas to engage their students and their communities. Alejandro Rangel Lopez is a voting rights activist from Dodge City, Kansas. He was the co-plaintiff of LULAC Rangel Lopez v. Cox, where he fought to protect polling locations. He testified about these efforts before the U.S. House Committee's Committee on House Administration in favor of H.R. 1, the For the People Act. And he leads Loudlight's content crew, where he engages Spanish-speaking and young Kansans in sharing their own democratic narrative. And in case you don't know who I am, I'm Melissa Seiler. I've just recently joined Loudlight as their advocacy director in November of 2020. I'm very passionate about civil and workers' rights. And if you know me, you'll probably most likely know me because I was recently the senior voting rights organizer for the ACLU of Kansas. I've also organized with Planned Parenthood, the Cross Border Network for Justice and Solidarity, and the AFL-CIO. And I'm really happy to be talking with such a powerful group of people today. So thanks for joining me, everyone. But yeah, let's just dive right into it. So, I mean, the nation was pretty shocked by what appeared to be a failed coup. But that was surrounding a vote to certify the 2020 election. Davis, can you explain what Marshall and what House Republicans did whenever they voted to not certify that election?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy for so many of y'all to see that Loudlight is not just me on some videos every week. There's a whole team of us. So in 2020, in the election, it's important to first remember that every state runs their own elections, right? And within that, every local government, usually every county, runs their own elections. So Kansas has or rather the United States has lots of different election systems happening, and they all have certain guidelines that they have to follow on the federal level. But then they have state guidelines, and then they have local guidelines. So it can be kind of a hodgepodge. And you can't directly compare any two counties or any two states. With that being said, the thing that we heard was the word fraud. And this word is thrown around all the time, right? Voter fraud, election fraud. The really important thing to take a step back and do is to define what fraud is. And fraud means that you intentionally or knowingly try to distort a free and fair election. Right? So that'd be like you intentionally voted twice, or you tried to make sure a certain batch of votes weren't counted. That's what fraud is. And so often every election problem, every issue gets bundled up in the word fraud, and that's really misleading, and it's really damaging our dialogue about elections. So in the 2020 election, one of the things we saw right as results were coming in were these accusations that states had massive voter fraud. And kind of interestingly enough, they happen to only be states that Donald Trump, lost in, were the ones that were being accused of voter fraud. And this led some Republicans, in at least the Senate, it was a hyper minority of Republican senators, to say that they didn't want to certify the election result, essentially saying that they wouldn't recognize that Joe Biden had won the election because they were challenging some states' outcomes. And the two big states there were Pennsylvania and Arizona that were challenged. One thing that's incredible to think about for Kansas is that Pennsylvania was being challenged because they had recently instituted mail voting. Kansas has had mail voting for over 25 years. Senator Roger Marshall won in an election where hundreds of thousands of people voted by mail, but he didn't, no one had accused the Kansans of committing fraud in this or anything. But for some reason, millions of people in Pennsylvania were being accused of having committed fraud for voting by mail. There's been no evidence in Arizona or in Pennsylvania that this fraud really happened. And one quote I think that sums it up well was actually a Trump-appointed appeals court judge who said, calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. And this is true not just in the 60 or so lawsuits that we saw around the 2020 election. This was true in the famous Kansas voting rights case where Chris Kobach had instituted some voter restrictions we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. But he had always accused all sorts of issues of elections, saying there's fraud here, there's fraud there. But whenever he actually got in the courtroom for 3 weeks, he was unable to find a single instance of someone actually committing fraud, of someone actually attempting to knowingly alter the outcome of an election. So that's where we got to. That's what the objection was based on. And as we saw, only 6 senators actually tried to object to the certification, and it was overruled and the election was certified. So that's where we're at now.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining what is actually like a fairly complicated process and all of what that actually meant going through it. As a result, we're seeing a mess of what they call election integrity bills being introduced in state houses across the country. And it's largely by state legislators who believe that this election was fraudulent in the same way that those who opposed the certification believed. We know that this throwing around the terms of election fraud, whether there's proof or not, whether that's the reality or not, this is not new to Kansas. Anita, you've been working in a state that has had these election integrity bills that sound kind of good whenever you're maybe thinking about it, but oftentimes people don't understand the real impact of what that means in our communities, what that means whenever you're registering voters. Can you explain what that has looked like here in Kansas in the past?
Yeah, so first I want to comment on the term election integrity bills. Because they actually do the exact opposite of that perceived purpose. It's legislation that gets drafted and presented in a way where it does sound good on the surface, but underneath it's just not. It's a backhanded way to disenfranchise voters. It requires people to jump through hoops, places barriers in between people and voting, and it's what common day voter suppression looks like. Instead of explicitly saying a certain group can't vote, we just pass laws and place unnecessary obstacles in their path. And these documentary proof of citizenship laws are known to target Black and brown people. And Kansas does have a history of this. Famously, or maybe infamously, we used to require a birth certificate to vote. And thank goodness that policy was overturned. It was absolutely crazy. All of us know that you have to provide these types of documents to even get an ID. So to require them again to register to vote is just this undue burden. It ended up disenfranchising 30,000 Kansans, and over half of those were young people, under 30. And so thankfully it's a thing of the past. In 2018, that law was struck down by a federal judge. And when it was tried to be reintroduced to the Supreme Court, they also recently rejected a bid to rehear the case. So thank democracy for that major win. But we want to be sure and call it what it is. We need to stand up against it. So they're not election integrity bills. It's voter suppression legislation. And it's just nonsensical requirements. It makes people harder to participate, harder for people to vote. And we got to watch out for it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, actually, Georgia was also one of those states that was, kind of infamously attacked for a lot of progress that they've made at eliminating some of the voter suppression in their state, both through grassroots organizations and through the legislature. But whenever you see, progress being made into enfranchising predominantly Black and Brown communities, you also see, unfortunately, oftentimes you see legislation like we're seeing in Georgia right now. There's a voter suppression bill inspired by Trump's accusations of fraud that we think is likely to be the model of the most recent round of restrictions to democratic access. The bill in Georgia includes eliminating no excuse absentee voting, to add a photo or a voter ID requirement to mail ballots for voters who are eligible with an excuse, to eliminate drop boxes, things like that. Alejandro, you've dealt with and fought the impact of restrictions like this in Dodge City and across the state of Kansas, and frankly, nationwide, you've been looking at this. What do you think is the biggest threat to democratic access in your community and at large?
Yeah, thank you all for having me here. I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us on Zoom and Facebook. But to answer your question, I think the single biggest threat to our democracy at this moment is the erosion of trust in the electoral process. By undermining trust, lawmakers and policy crafters fabricate the justifications for the many voter suppression tactics that we're seeing being implemented across the country, and even here in our home state of Kansas. This is a huge issue and something that President Trump has pushed to throw out votes and create confusion around the results of the 2020 election. And by eroding this trust in American democracy, policymakers can and have enacted policies that limit who can vote and thus, reduce turnout. And these policies primarily or almost exclusively target Black and Brown voters. And some of these policies, can't, if we discussed all of them, we'd be here all night. But the most prevalent that we're seeing across the country are, number one, sowing distrust and reducing availability of mail-in and absentee voting. So, that was the main issue in the Pennsylvania suits that we saw. They sow distrust by saying, people are getting their family members' ballots and voting for them, or they're not delivering them, or they're not certified. All of these bogus claims that have been disproven by the courts and by election analysts. And we'll keep seeing these kinds of attacks on mail-in ballots in the future, since they were so widely used and contributed to the victory that the policymakers who are mainly pushing these policies, an election outcome that they didn't like. And number two, they're reducing the number of polling locations. I have personal experience with that. When they eliminate voting locations or consolidate them, they're not doing this in white neighborhoods or white communities. They're doing this in Black and Brown neighborhoods and cities. And I saw this here. We had before litigation, we had up to hour-long waits to vote on election day. And we saw the news coverage in Texas and Georgia where people were waiting hours upon hours and long lines that wrapped around the block, who knows how many times, just to cast their ballot. And we have to watch out for this in these communities, because these are the most in danger of having these types of changes implemented for them or in their communities. Number three, they're implementing voter ID laws. Again, all Kansans have experience with this. If we lived through the Chris Kobach as term as Secretary of State. Davis already touched on this, and as well as Anita, but yeah, we saw this in Kansas, and we're going to keep seeing it as they find a way to go circumvent the courts and implement these types of policies again. And then number 4 is purging voter rolls. Election officials purge voting rolls a couple months prior to the election, and with that they disenfranchise thousands or even millions of voters of color. And it goes without saying, but when they say they're purging the voter rolls to get rid of dead voters or people who haven't voted in a while, whatever, they're these purges affect people of color the most. And when talking about such restrictions, it's important to note who is being targeted and whose votes are being put under scrutiny. These are the votes of Black and Brown Americans who turned out in record numbers this past year and swung the election in favor of President-elect Biden and other down ballot candidates. These lawmakers have no issue at all with white voters turning out, but immediately yell fraud when Black and brown voters come out and the election results aren't what they wanted. So this is a real and present danger for us, and one in which the voting rights of minorities are at stake. We have to keep an eye out for it moving forward.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you bring up voter purges too, because that's one of the other concerns that we've had to address in the courts, is having insecure voter files that wrongfully identify registered voters who are eligible to vote and perhaps give a false red flag that they're not somebody who should be voting. That's another one of the Kobach era pieces of legislation that we've been able to defeat in the courts. And I mean, but whether it's stricter voter ID laws, or it's DPOC 2.0, or it's maybe figuring out some kind of other restrictions. Davis, what legislation has been introduced that you're worried about in regards to restricting voting rights in Kansas? And are there any good bills introduced that perhaps we should be aware of?
Okay, so it is the start of session. We're a week and a day into the Kansas legislative session. A couple bills that we've already seen are some minor tweaks to restrict mail voting. I mean, this was kind of inevitable, right? I mean, the narrative is so big to claim mail voter fraud, although there is no evidence, that it's not surprising to see the legislature attempt to respond to this. I mean, this can be one of the frustrating things, like legislators try to react to things. So if people make a lot of noise about something, no matter how verifiably false it is, legislators will attempt to respond to that. And we've heard plenty of conspiracy theories already in Kansas election committees about Dominion voting machines and that kind of stuff. A bill did come up already. It was supposed to have a hearing today. I was supposed to be giving testimony on it, but at the last minute it was canceled. Because there's some COVID concerns today at the State House. But there's a bill, it's HB 2054, I believe. And what it would do is make it so that only people who are directly related, so family members or caregivers, would be able to assist you in returning a mail ballot. Again, this is something where for 25 years or so, if you want someone to help you return your mail ballot, you have to write the name of the person who you're asking to help you, and then the person who's helping you signs their name. And so we allow neighbors to help neighbors. The kind of bizarre thing about the bill is anything nefarious is already illegal, right? It would be illegal to take someone's ballot and not return it. This would just make it illegal to successfully help someone. And there's also other concerns to this. Last year, a similar bill was proposed in the disability rights community, obviously has huge concerns about this. If you're, paraplegic and, the person who maybe is assisting you left, it would actually become criminal if you just asked your neighbor to come over to put it in your mailbox. This is bizarre. And it's also totally unnecessary. Again, like, what is the problem they're trying to fix? Again, fraud, we really don't have any evidence that this is a real problem. And we know that most problems in elections are about, are really about funding and training, right? Our election system at every level is incredibly underfunded. And that's where problems happen, is people are overworked and the system is underfunded. We have bad, outdated technology. We have people who are asked to work incredibly absurd hours that cause human error. So those are, I expect more mail ballot attacks coming. There's also a bill that tries to strip away some of the emergency powers that exist, which allow mail ballots to come in even later in cases of emergency. There's a bill to strip that away. On the positive front, or actually really quick, on other negative fronts, I would say it's the start of session. So I expect a lot more bad bills. There was already discussion of maybe trying to restrict who can help people register to vote. I mean, in Texas, you have to be deputized and go through training just to assist someone with getting registered to vote. So those are also concerns. On the positive front, an issue that I've worked on for years, Loud Light has worked on for years, is provisional ballots. We made a lot of advances to this point in this election. I would actually say this election would have been kind of a disaster if Kansas hadn't implemented some things, like if people forgot to sign their ballot, now county clerks have to actually call those people and allow them to cure their ballot so it will count. But the number one issue we now have is that there was probably around, we don't have final numbers yet, but there was probably around 10,000 Kansas citizens that had their votes thrown out because they weren't showing up as registered before the 21-day deadline. That's actually a law that Kobach implemented, the 21-day registration cutoff. That's a Kobach law too. It used to be a lot shorter of a timeline before it cut off voter registration. There's all sorts of people that fall in that gap. So we expect there to be a bill to try to expand how many provisional votes can count. And again, I would emphasize these are eligible voters, like they're getting registered, but they're just throwing out their vote for that election. So we're looking at that. And another positive thing that could happen is if we're really concerned about, election integrity, how loaded that term can be. I know 5 years ago, I was fighting really hard with people like Representative Owsley and others to get election audits passed. And we did have those this year, but we actually saw pretty weak election audits. There's a lot of ways that we could improve how we do election and auditing. And those things really should have bipartisan support, because that's about making sure that the count is accurate. So we definitely have a lot of bad stuff I expect to come our way, but I think potentially some opportunities for good stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, let's just go right into like, what do we do about it? Anita, do you want to take this first? Like with both Loud Light and in general, what can Kansans do to get involved in protecting democracy this legislative session?
So the number one thing is probably what we like to say at the end of the Loud Light videos is stay tuned and stay engaged. And it's keep your eyes on what's happening in the Capitol, because really a lot of having individual power is showing up and being aware of the issues around you and having a voice on them. And so really being engaged this legislative session, hopefully you're already following Loud Light on social media platforms and are following the information we put out. Also wanted to pitch the programs that Loud Light runs year round, because there's always an opportunity to be engaged with us. As the program director, I run all of our youth fellowships, coordinating with other colleges to work with students, get them engaged in the political process, whether it's electoral programs in the fall or the legislative session in the spring. We also do community organizing programs in the summer. So throughout the year, there's ways to be engaged with Loud Light. So definitely sign up with the stuff that's provided at the end of this webinar and make sure you get engaged, get involved.
Thank you so much, Anita. Alejandro, do you want to take this next?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we're looking for folks to join the Loud Light content crew to expand our reach in digital organizing and education. So, please sign up to be part of that team. But in general, you don't have to be super well versed or educated on these issues to get involved. You know, a lot of y'all know me from my, ACLU litigation, fighting for voting rights here in Dodge City. But that started with me just with a rudimentary understanding of how to register people to vote and wanting to get my classmates and their parents registered to vote. Um, and through that, I discovered an issue, in my city or in my county. um and as I say, the rest is history. I That's how it started, and I didn't know much, but along the way I learned, so like everything that I do now, and I'm still doing a whole bunch of learning from those around me, and from my experiences. But that goes to show there are no limits to what you can do, and you don't need much to get involved. Um, but yeah, like when I after my litigation, um, last February, I believe, this past February, um, or no, 2019, my bad. In 2019, I was, testifying before the Committee on House Administration, in favor of the For the People Act, a piece of legislation that is now being reintroduced this year and would address and prevent many of the attempts to disenfranchise voters across the country. Um, so, you know, aside from that's the national level stuff, but there's so much that needs to be done, here in Kansas and in your community. So join us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I love keeping things local, um, because that's how you actually build power is within our local communities, and that's what ends up making a national impact, right? Davis, what do you think?
So, I mean, first off, everything they said, I think that there's this like, misunderstanding that to get involved, you need to know everything and have all the answers. And you don't, right? You just get involved by trying to help other people, help register someone to vote. And then you run into a barrier. And then all of a sudden you founded a voting rights organization, like that's how it honestly happened on my side. This was all kind of like an accident of just getting involved, and then you build upon it. And you don't have to be an expert on anything either, right, to get involved. You just have to be willing to seek out those answers and try to help other people. Also, of course, donating, right? I will always plug that, donating to Loud Light so that we can grow our programs, expand our reach. I know that Melissa, coming on as our advocacy director, is going to be sending out some volunteer forms. One thing that we're really trying to this year is, as we grow, give more opportunities for other people to get involved, like helping you give testimony, help you plan out testimony at the State House, help you learn how to get involved in your local community or meet your county clerk, or just get more deeply involved in whatever part of this drive to have a better democracy you're interested in.
Yeah, I love all of that. I totally agree. I will say that as far as Loud Light is concerned, I mean, there's a lot of ways that folks can get involved. I know that we as an organization are expanding pretty rapidly this year. And we're so thankful that Kansas has supported Loud Light in such a way that we are able to grow. And so, yes, please donate so that way we can keep on doing the great work that we do. But tomorrow I will be sending out an email to everybody who's signed up. So if you are following this on Facebook, we will be posting the link in the Facebook comments tomorrow as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a ton of organizing opportunities with Loud Light, whether that's organizing within your own community, and doing things like phone banking and knocking doors and talking to your friends and your family, to digital organizing and digital storytelling, and kicking it with Alejandro and in coming up with, how we're going to be able to create more online content to reach a broader audience even. Electoral organizing, and I know that we just got done with an election, but we've got municipals coming up this year, and then 2022 is just around the corner. So making sure that folks get registered and are aware of what's on the ballot is important. Of course, there's going to be a lot of other work that folks can do around issue advocacy, research, data analysis. Of course, our amazing youth fellowship programs are only going to continue to grow. And then, make sure you're registered to vote, make sure everybody in your life is registered to vote, and make sure you sign up with Loud Light or with some of the amazing coalition partners that we have, like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, etc., to register people in your community too. So with that, I want to thank everybody so much. For those of you who are on Facebook, stay engaged, stick around, and we'll see you, next week with Davis's video. For everybody who's here on Zoom, I'm going to go ahead and log off Facebook, and we can stick around for an exclusive Q&A. Thank you all so much.